Chapter 15, Communication and Documentation. So first we're going to talk about communication systems, and how to talk on a radio. So depending on where you are, you'll see a variety of technologies in use. So radio is one-way pagers, cell phones, traditional phones. So radio systems, so these are pretty common because they're pretty reliable and don't necessarily need a lot of expensive infrastructure to work. So different components here: base stations, mobile radios, portable radios, repeaters, microwave transmitters. Talk a little bit about digital radio signals. So what do we use here in our fire department? Probably guess the answer is all of the above. So we use cell phones, portable radios, and repeaters all pretty regularly. So just going to describe all these different bits. So a repeater is basically a device that takes the signal from a lower power, like a portable radio, like that thing, and then retransmits it at a higher amplitude so that it'll go further. So we have a repeater up on Moscow Mountain. It's actually on the West Twin Hill up there, and that's how we talk to our dispatch over in Pullman. So these little handheld radios output like 5 watts. That's their power. The repeater, when it gets up to there, it'll rebroadcast it out about 100 watts. So it makes it go a lot further. The base stations, so that's basically the same thing as these little handhelds, except it's a plug-in unit, plugs into the wall, and has a little antenna up on the building. But it's going to use the same basic technology. It broadcasts out at a little higher wattage, but it'll hit up to the repeater and then out to the world. When we're doing our call-ins to the hospital, we usually do that over a cell phone. So we operate on frequencies that are regulated by the FCC. Actually, all radio frequencies are regulated by the FCC, but you can't transmit on the frequencies that we use without an explicit license to do so. In principle, the FCC can monitor radio traffic and give you fines and stuff if you're not using the frequency appropriate or using inappropriate language, that kind of thing. So how to talk on a radio. So make sure your radio is on. It doesn't work terribly well if the power is off. Turn your volume properly. Reduce background noise in nearby radios. So if you guys have ever been in any kind of public venue where somebody has a microphone and moves it right in front of a speaker, and you get that terrible squelchy whine, like feedback loop thing going on, that happens with our radios too. So if you grab one of these little guys and have it cranked up to the maximum volume, and then jump in one of our apparatus, an ambulance or a fire truck, and start talking on that fire truck radio, you'll get terrible, crazy feedback, and nobody will hear you. So make sure that you've got radios, handheld radios turned down if you're sitting in a rig, or turned off is better. If you can, reduce background noise. Most of these modern radios have decent noise filters on them to pick up just your voice, but if you can get out of noisy backgrounds, then get out of noisy backgrounds. Make sure the frequency is clear before you start talking. This is the one that we screw up all the time. So the biggest thing is to make sure that you're not butting in between somebody else's conversation. So you can think of these things as a giant megaphone in space, and when you talk on this thing, the whole county hears what you're saying. And it's one person talking at a time. So whoever's got the most powerful radio is the one that's going to be heard. So if you are in the fire station with a base station that puts out like 50 watts, then you're going to talk all over anybody that's trying to transmit with just one of these portables. The same thing with our radios in the fire trucks and ambulances. Those will drown out pretty much any portable radio. So one person gets to talk at a time. It's not duplex conversation like you're talking to somebody on a cell phone, you can interrupt them or something, right? They can hear you and you can hear them at the same time. It doesn't work that way with these. It's just one person talking, everybody else listening. So make sure you're not jumping in between somebody else's conversations. So it's usually good to listen for at least 5 or 10 seconds, if not, a full 30 seconds, just to make sure that somebody else wasn't talking back and forth and still using that frequency. The next thing, push your press to talk button. Most of these things is just the biggest button on the side. We have these things set up to do a little both privacy codes that trigger the repeater, and they transmit the ID of the radio itself. So both of those add up to about half a second of delay from when you push the button to when you can actually start talking. So the little handhelds will at least beep at you. So you push the button and then it'll beep when it's ready to actually have you talk at it. If you just push the button and start talking at the same time, you'll cut off at least a word or 2 words of whatever your message is. And if your message is pretty short, then you might get nothing out. So push the button, hold the button. So when you're talking to one of these things, you want to have it about right here, 2 or 3 inches away from your face. And we talk across the microphones and not into it like this. Okay, so you'll get more clarity if you're talking to the side of it than straight at it. When we're talking to somebody else, we say their call sign. So like my call sign is 519, that's my EMT number. When you talk to an ambulance, I'd say ambulance 42 from 519. You don't actually have to say the from, but that's really how you should think about it in your mind, is talking to, from. So you're saying their name first, then you. They'll say either go ahead, as if I'm listening, or they might just say back their call sign. So if I say ambulance 42 from 519, they might just say 42. And then I'll know that, okay, I got the right person and now I can give my message. Or they might say, go ahead. So go ahead is a little less preferred than just saying their call sign back, because that way you know who you're talking to if they just say their call sign. If they're not ready to listen to you, if they're busy doing something, they may say, stand by. And then you just gotta wait until they get back to you, basically. Speak slowly and clearly. If you get excited and start talking real fast, it's hard to understand. Our current radios are pretty good, so they're not as bad as radios used to be. It used to be pretty treacherous. You had to really speak slowly and stuff, but our modern radios work pretty well. You will find some dead spots around town where you just won't get anything out, hardly at all. You need to keep it brief. So again, one person in the whole county gets to talk on this thing at a time, on our frequency anyway. There are multiple frequencies, but if we're talking on the fire and EMS frequency, basically it's one at a time for all the responders in the county. Well, all the Moscow responders. The outlying agencies have one frequency that they share. So we use plain English, we don't do codes. So 10 codes were a big thing, especially among law enforcement, and you'll still see them using some 10 codes occasionally. So like 10-4 being I'm okay, that kind of thing. 20. If somebody asks what your 20 is, that's an old 10 code. A 1020 is your location. But in general, we avoid codes. In general, keep it brief and don't use unnecessary words. So be advised especially doesn't add anything to your information content. So if you get on scene and say, be advised there's a deer in the road or something, that doesn't mean anything more than there's a deer in the road, right? Please is okay. It's nice to be professional. I'm okay with please. I'm not so okay with be advised. The same traffic thing, we overuse this in our department, especially for things like on scene. So if one unit calls on scene, the next unit says whatever, like ambulance 42 on scene, the next one is like medic 3, same traffic, which isn't as clear as just on scene, and you're actually taking up more radio time saying same traffic because it's more syllables. So in general, same traffic, I don't really care so much for. If you're using it to kind of clone somebody's long-winded thing, then fine. Like if one unit calls clear of North 95 en route back to Moscow, and then you get on and say, okay, same traffic, that's actually saving some airtime and is probably okay. But yeah, that's my little soapbox on same traffic. So for numbers, sometimes addresses, sometimes numbers sound the same. So for like call signs, we'll often say like 42 instead of 42, but for like individual call signs, we usually say out the numbers 519 instead of like 519 or 530 instead of 530, that kind of thing. Addresses, again, if you're looking at your map book and you can't figure out what address you're supposed to go to from dispatch because it doesn't seem to be there, make sure that you heard the number right and say it back. Is it 1999 or is it 1999? We don't use the patient's name over the radio. And we don't use profanities or slander. So these things are not encrypted at all. There's a little privacy code that gets transmitted to key up the repeater. So it's not straightforward to just buy a transmitter off Amazon and access our repeaters, but it is straightforward to buy a scanner or a little radio and listen in on our channel. That is pretty easily doable. So there are lots of folks out there that have scanners, radio scanners, and just listen to traffic all day long. And so never assume that we're just talking to other first responders. We're talking to the entire county, including the public. Whenever possible, we use objective and impartial statements. So we wouldn't get on scene and say, this guy looks drunk as a skunk. We'd say he's ataxic or ataxic and possible ETOH abuse or something like that, something more impartial. In general, we instead of I for apparatus, especially we're clear of the scene instead of I'm clear of the scene. Affirmative and negative are usually a little bit easier to pick out than yes and no. We really don't transmit this kind of information over the radio at any point, but in general, if you're transmitting stuff, then you want to give just objective signs, symptoms, that kind of thing, instead of offering diagnoses over the radio, so you don't say my patient's having a heart attack or whatever. You say that they're having chest pain. That kind of thing. Again, we usually don't transmit that kind of information over the radio anyway. We use cell phones. We don't say over after transmitting. You'll see that in movies. I'm just going to cross that a bunch of times. We don't say over. You just stop talking and people figure it out that you're done using the channel if they're paying attention. Avoid slang and unauthorized abbreviations. And then EMS frequency is only for EMS events. So we don't use the radio to make sure that everybody's coming to a meeting or whatever. That kind of thing. It's emergency use. Again, I mentioned this before, but 2 units transmitted at the same time, depending on who's got the more powerful radio, they're either going to just walk all over the low power guy and the low power guy isn't going to be hurt at all. If it's like 2 radios like this at the same time, sometimes they just garble each other and you get wah, 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 like somebody's talking, their hand in their mouth or something, and nothing happens, nothing comes through. So when you're talking to dispatch, depending on who the dispatcher is, they will summarize things back to you to make sure that they understood it correctly. So especially like scene size ups and stuff, dispatch will summarize it back. Often instead of saying copy, dispatch will just say the current time, and that's just for their recording purposes. All this stuff, all the radio traffic is recorded, and when they just say the time, it makes it easier to go back after an event and figure out what time things happened and that kind of thing. So. Read that one. Okay, so how many voting for A, B, votes for B, C, D, couple votes for D. So the answer is B, take your portable radio with you. One that's the mobile radio that's in the ambulance is basically wired in, it's not removable. So that's just a terminology question. Mobile radios are mobile in that they're in a vehicle, but they're not something you can pull out of the vehicle. You do want to have a radio on with you, like in the patient's house or wherever you are, just so that you know what else is going on in the county and whether there's another call going out or whether dispatch is trying to get a hold of you for some reason, which they occasionally do. You also need to be able to call for help, say if you get into a sticky situation or something from a scene. Okay. Questions on general radio transmitting stuff? Okay. Radio reports. Again, we give our reports to the hospital by cell phone. There are places where this is done over the radio still. Basically, you're giving them what they need to know to prepare for your arrival. So it's only the most important information. Especially if you're doing this over the radio, nice and slow and clear. So basically you're going to start off with who you are. So we have a special phone number that we dial for written in ZR. And they know that it's from an ambulance, and so they answer it right away. But we still got to tell them who we are. So, hello, this is Benji on ambulance 42. We're bringing in a 29-year-old male. You can give patient name, and date of birth. They like the date of birth so that they can look them up in their system. Patient's complaining of back pain beginning 5 days ago. Is alert and oriented. Has a history of back surgery 3 months ago. No other major illnesses. Current vitals are, whatever they are. Patient was complaining of tenderness upon palpation of L5. Was able to walk to the ambulance. Giving oxygen, we're not giving oxygen. We've got them on a backboard, whatever you've done. We'll put a tourniquet on, that would be something to say in there. If you've given any medications like sugar for hypoglycemia, if you've given nitro, if you've given albuterol, anything like that, then you definitely want to tell them that. And ask them if they have any questions, and then tell them how long it'll take you to get there. We'll be there in 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes. They get pretty grumpy if we call them and like, oh, we're pulling into the bay now. So give them a little heads up, more than that. We have pretty much this whole list on a little cheat sheet by the phone in the ambulance, so you remember all these things. If you're out there on scene, remember that we can call for medical direction at any point. So we do that again by calling that special phone number we have into the ER. You can ask to talk to a doctor, and they will get on the phone with you. You can tell them what's going on, and if you're having a particular issue with the patient, ask them what they want you to do. If something is unclear, ask them to repeat it. If they tell you something that sounds kind of crazy or beyond your scope, then you should make sure to point that out. Don't just blindly do whatever it is that seems inappropriate. Yeah. And when we get our patient to the hospital, we're going to give another report. So we've just talked to them on the phone and told them we're coming, and so they know what to expect. But when we get there, it might be a different nurse, and we might actually have the doctor there. But it's likely going to be somebody, there's at least a fair chance, it's going to be somebody different than who just took that phone report. So we introduce the patient, and then we tell them what's going on. So more or less the same stuff that was in that medical radio report. Chief complaint, history of present illness, what your assessment was, what you did for them, did it work, did it not work, vital signs. Okay, so a big part of being an EMT is talking to people, both within your own crew and patients. So again, we're talking to our crew, we're talking to other healthcare providers. Candidness is good. So when it comes time to patient communication, think of it as showtime. So these next few slides are from this presentation or program called Verbal Judo, which is aimed at like law enforcement more, but it's pretty decent information, so I added it here. The idea here is no matter what is going wrong with your day, the patient is having a really bad day because they had to call an ambulance. So put all your personal stuff aside and be ready to help this person out. So remember that a lot of our communication is nonverbal. So if you stand over somebody in a threatening kind of manner or use a dismissive tone, that kind of stuff, that's going to dominate versus the words you use. So if you come in and kind of angrily shout, "It's nice to meet you," they're not going to get the "it's nice to meet you" part. They're going to get the angry, shouting-y stuff, right? So use good words, but just pay attention to your tone, your eye contact, and your posture and position. Words are the least important. So being an EMT is a fairly jargon-heavy discipline, right? So you guys are finding that out. There's a lot of big words, and you're going to learn a lot more big words. And if you start jabbering those back at your patient, they may or may not follow along. So make sure your patient is understanding what you're telling them. Always be honest. If you're splinting and they got a broken leg and you're going to have to move their leg a bit to put the splint on, don't tell them it's going to be fine and it's not going to hurt at all, because it's going to hurt when you're moving things, right? So be honest, especially with kids. They're going to be anxious and freaking out, and if you lie to them and say, "Oh, it's not going to hurt at all," then there goes the trust, and they're not going to trust you at all anymore. So. Okay. So again, this 5-step hard style thing is straight out of Verbal Judo, and basically this is a kind of a cookbook or a procedure for getting people to do things that they don't want to do. So if you just ask somebody to do something instead of telling somebody to do something, then this will solve your problem like 90% of the time. So even with difficult people that maybe don't want to go to the hospital with you, if you ask them instead of telling them they're coming, so instead of saying, "We need you to come to the hospital," it would be, "We'd appreciate it if you come to the hospital with us and get checked out," that kind of thing. So ask instead of command. You'll get a lot more compliance. So if they say no to that, then you get into giving them a decent explanation of why they need to go to the hospital. Reasonably frequently we'll get calls to people that have fallen either from standing or downstairs or something like that after having a little bit too much to drink, and they're a little bit belligerent and don't really want to go. So in that case, you probably explain to them, you've fallen, you might have a head injury. We can't diagnose that kind of thing in the field. We don't have an X-ray machine. We need really like you to go down to the hospital so that you can get, you know, the appropriate care and stuff. And so just tell them why they need to go as best you can. If they still don't want to go, so they're still saying no, then you give them some options. So here's your options. You can come down to the hospital with us. They can give a quick x-ray of your head. They can see whether you've got internal bleeding or not. If you stay here and go to sleep, you might have that head injury get worse. You might not wake up. You could die. So it's not necessarily going to be that stark of terms all the time, but explain their options to them. Okay. So if at that point they still are like, nope, I'm not going to go, then you just use this little phrase. Is there anything I can say or do to change your mind? I'd like to think so. And if they still say no, then it's time for whatever the appropriate action is. And so that's going to depend on the call, obviously. If they're of sound mind, sort of alert-oriented to those 4 questions, and they've met all the requirements that they can sign a refusal, then at this point maybe you have them sign a refusal. If they're like suicidal or something, and you decided that they're a danger to themselves or others, something where you can't just leave them and have them sign a refusal, then it's time to call the MD and get them under a 24-hour mental health hold, or use the police, or whatever it is you need to do. If you're hearing these words out of a police officer, the answer is yes, because no means you're about to get jumped and put in handcuffs and dragged off forcibly. So this is the they're not, so like when police officers are going to take somebody down, they don't look at each other and go, "Are you ready, Bob? Are you ready, Bob? Ready? 3, 2, 1, pounce." That's because that kind of tips off whoever they're getting ready to do. So this is the countdown phrase. Is there anything I can do to say change your mind? If you answer no, then yeah, you're about to get more physically handled. The idea with this is it's just a fairly simple script that you can use to not get into loops, basically. If you talk to some difficult patients, they'll just go back and forth. I don't really want to go. And you'll say something and you'll just talk back and forth, and not get anywhere. So basically you follow a little script, tick, 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 do whatever the action is that's appropriate, and then something is happening, you're moving on, and you're not just stuck there arguing with somebody or going over the same material over and over again, because that happens. Questions on that? So special considerations, be extra compassionate and respectful. I mean, you always should be compassionate and respectful, but folks that have any kind of mental disabilities, people need hearing aids or are visually impaired, just make sure that they're understanding what's going on, and make sure you're doing what you need to do to talk to them. So if you need to get close to somebody and talk loud, then get close and talk loud. That's okay. Language barriers can sometimes be an issue. So we do have plenty of international students in town. Typically there's somebody there that can translate for you. That's what I've seen most of the time. If not, you can get on with dispatch and try and find an interpreter. If you've got apps on your phone, you can try and use an interpreter, interpretation app on your phone to communicate. It's not a horrible idea, With kids, make sure you're down at their level. So stand over, hover over them like that. Kneel down, get in front of them. Like I mentioned before, just don't lie to kids. If it's going to hurt, it's going to hurt. Just let them know. It's not going to make it be super easier for them, but it's better than lying to them. Okay, questions on that stuff? Okay. So the documentation part. So every time we go out on a call, actually every time we get dispatched, whether we even leave the station or not, we'll write up a PCR. And this is just our written long-term documentation of whatever happened on that call. So for the ones where we don't even leave the station, it's just whatever, we're dispatched for this and canceled before route, and that's about all there is to the report. But whenever we get out on the scene and actually do patient care, and we write a fairly extensive deal. So we do web-based. We used to have handwritten stuff. We've flirted with the electronic tablet stuff. Haven't ever implemented that. Basically, we sit at a computer after the call's done and enter stuff that way. So again, we're documenting what happened. It's entered into the patient's permanent medical record thing. There isn't like a permanent government medical record, whatever repository out there or something. We used to give a copy of our PCR when they were handwritten. We'd put it in the patient's file, like written at the ER. But since we've gone to the web-based thing, we don't really do that anymore. If the hospital wants a copy of the PCR, they can request one. So this is a legal document. The law enforcement or the courts can get it if they subpoena it, get a judge to get that turned over. You can't just give it up to a law enforcement officer or basically anybody that wasn't on the call doesn't have a right to see that. Just people that were directly involved in the patient care or continuing care of that patient and for billing purposes. It serves administrative functions, so again, demographic information, insurance, and billing stuff. It can be a tool for education and research. So we'll get statistics on like response times, survivability of like out of hospital cardiac arrest, lots of stuff like that. If there's trends and issues, then we can identify that stuff and do targeted continuing education. We have things like call volume standards and stuff where you need to go on so many calls to keep proficient. Track that. And then again, like quality improvement stuff. So calls that go especially well, maybe we use those as an example, train other folks. Figure out how to make each call go better. Opportunities for improvement. Make sure that we're doing what we're supposed to be doing, putting on C-collars when we're supposed to, that kind of thing. So parts of VCR, so we'll have run data, just like who it was that dispatched, date, time, who was on the call, what their training was. We've got a web interface that we can look up our times from dispatch, so we can enter all the dispatch times into our software. We used to actually have to call dispatch for those times, but we can just pull them off a website now. We get detailed patient information in there. We don't always have all of this, but if we have it, we put it in there. Anything anybody told us about the patient, general impression. We'll write just a little narrative summary of the call. I'll talk more about that. That'll include history and treatment. Let's document where we took somebody. So this narrative summary is basically a few paragraphs, and it basically summarizes the whole call in those few paragraphs. So we've fairly well standardized on this SOAP format here. Some other places you might see the CHET format. So each of these things represents basically a paragraph in your narrative. So you start off with all the subjective stuff. So like dispatched for whatever it was, one vehicle accident, patients complaining of cervical pain around C5, states they have whatever medical history, allergies, that kind of thing, all goes into subjective, whatever they told you, like their pain levels, that kind of thing, anything that's not objective. And objective, you get in there and it's like, arrived on scene to find patient sitting in vehicle off the roadway, whatever damage was to the vehicle, patient is awake and talking, but confused or something. You'd put in all your pertinent findings on your physical exam, whether negative or positive, so head, ears, eyes, nose, throat, normal, bleeding from whatever arm, that kind of thing. Just go by all the body parts that you looked at. Then your assessment, this is your best guess as to what's going wrong. So possible broken arm, possible heart attack, possible whatever. And we usually use that little word possible in there just because we don't have official diagnostic capabilities, and we don't have x-ray machines. We're not MDs basically. So, but your best guess as to what's going wrong. And then plan, so this is what you did. So we did our assessment, we extricated the patient with a backboard, we put him on the gurney, we transported monitoring vitals, whatever you did down here. CHET is pretty similar. The C and H are kind of both the subjective parts here. Evaluation is pretty much equivalent to the objective, and then treatment is the plan part, so they're fairly similar kind of documentation, organization things, but yeah. In general, plain English, approved abbreviations. So we're writing this into a computer, so there's no reason you can't have correct spelling and grammar. When we used to write these things out by hand, it was a little bit different, but appropriate medical terminology. If it happened, good or bad, it needs to be in there. So if you accidentally dropped something on the patient, oops, my flashlight fell out of my pocket and whacked the patient in the eye, then you probably should document that in the report. Special documentation issues, that all this stuff is covered by this HIPAA law. So basically, only people that need to know the information get to know the information. Since we're doing this online now, it's all more or less handled for us as far as the security stuff goes. You just need to remember to not tell your other EMT friends or whatever friends specific protected health information. Refusals are especially high liability. It's not a terribly hard case to make that whatever, somebody should have gone to the hospital and didn't and then died. So for refusals, we write up at least as much, if not more, documentation as a patient that we transported. So remember, if it didn't happen, it didn't happen. These things are legal documents. You get yourself in trouble falsifying these things. When we were handwriting these things, it was more of an issue for correcting errors. You had to insert your correction and initial by it and that kind of thing. For the electronic web-based things, it keeps a log of who's edited what information in the PCR, so it's fine to fix errors if there's errors in a patient care report. So what about this guy?
Go through 5 steps.
What if he's just walking away and doesn't want to talk to you?
Record it.
Basically. This isn't actually that uncommon of a goal with cell phones these days. Somebody will see somebody lying down, whatever. Oh man, that guy looks injured or sick or something. And call and just keep cruising down the road, and you'll go to see and either find somebody that was just sleeping or isn't even there. But, so is that a patient? For the purposes of a patient care report, yes. Do you need to chase him down and make him submit to an exam? No. And so, is it worth your time to, whatever, try and get him to sign a refusal? Yes, probably. But again, if he doesn't want to have anything to do with you and is just not going to talk to you or do anything, then fine. Let him go. But you still got to do all the documentation. You just document the whole interaction. If you can get a formal refusal, yes. If they don't want to sign the form, they don't want to sign the form. MCIs, multiple casualty incidents. So So this is the kind of one exception to the rule that every patient gets a PCR. If you've got 30 people lying on the ground, all of them in various states of dying, we don't really have time for all of the specific individualized documentation. And their care of each patient is going to be by multiple different agencies, probably all strung together. So we do this real shorthand kind of documentation card, these NCI cards. So we basically have a space to write, sets of vitals, little tags you can tear off when they get transported or moved to different places. Their overall categorization is these 4 levels. In these cases, we're not going to write a PCR for every single patient just because logistically we can't. We'll talk more about MCIs in a later chapter. All right, questions on communication documentation?